Oh, dear Rosen, today we're going to be talking about Hegel's Justification of Hegel, Part 1, Sections 1 through 3. We're going to be considering elements of the philosophy of right, mainly, and I think it's important to see the philosophy of right as having a epistemological justification function for Hegel. It's a way of Hegel justifying Hegel, because even if you think the philosophy that he puts forth is internally consistent, valuable, you like it a lot, someone can simply come along and say, well, philosophy's a waste of time, or it's privileged, or it's just something that academics do, that it's not practical. And on what grounds could you kind of argue against that, right? Now, I think you could make pragmatic arguments where you say, well, philosophy helps me live my life, increases the beauty, truth, and goodness that I experience. But someone could simply say, yeah, that's all well and nice, but that's for you. That's just you. Why should we think that philosophy has any function beyond the immediacy of just helping an individual in their life? Why should we think that philosophy matters? If philosophy doesn't matter, then why should we engage in what Hegel calls the phenomenological journey of Hegel? And if we don't engage in that, we don't get to the science of logic. So why should we think philosophy matters? Why, and by extension, why should we think Hegel matters? And this is problematic, of course, because, if you do philosophy, you think Hegel matters, but then you're just, you're justifying philosophy within philosophy. But you're assuming the presuppositions that make philosophy have value. So how can philosophy have value, or reason to think it has value, without that justification coming from within philosophy according to philosophy? And this is a big problem. To justify a field of study, its justification kind of has to come from something outside of that philosophy. Otherwise, you would just have reason to think that it's self-serving. Of course, philosophy sees reason to do philosophy in and of itself. But the question is, can philosophy gain justification from something outside of it? This kind of suggests a bit of Gödel and the incompleteness problem of how mathematics cannot be its own grounding, it cannot provide axioms for itself. In order for, math to justify itself, it needs to go beyond itself. And he comes up with, Gödel's numbers, and basically the way I always describe it is that if you have coherence, you don't have correspondence, but if you have correspondence, you don't have coherence. So there's a problem where justification for a field has to be outside of that field. Otherwise, there's no reason to think that it isn't just self-serving, that it isn't just full of itself. For me, there is a way to read the elements of the philosophy of right, which is the full title. I'll probably just say the philosophy of right a lot. There's a way to read that as a justification of philosophy from outside of philosophy, which would be Hegel's justification of Hegel. Now, I'm not trying to say that the book has nothing to do with government or state or the political body or anything like that. Often I just feel as if Hegel's playing many games at once. And when Hegel is providing a roadmap for a political science roadmap, he might also be providing something else. And I think there is a justification of philosophy here from outside of philosophy. Hegel tells us in Elements of the Philosophy of Right that he has fully developed the nature of speculative knowledge in his Science of Logic, which is to say he has different plans for this book. He tells us this work is based on the logical spirit. It is also chiefly from the point of view that he would wish this treatise to be understood and judged. For what it deals with is science, and in science, the content is essentially inseparable from the form. Now, the word science is always interesting, and I don't know that this would be an example where not knowing the German is problematic, because there is the science in German that starts with that W word that means just a rigorous study. So, there's the rigorous study. But then there's also science as we know today, which is where you try to remove the subject and reach conclusions that are more quote-unquote objective. They're not as subject-dependent. Now, of course, in Hegel, the subject-object divide is done away with. And so when Hegel talks about science, he would always be meaning a science of which is inseparable from the scientist, which gives us all sorts of interesting conclusions that have to be explored elsewhere. But, there is a way to think of Hegel, when Hegel talks about science, there's a way to think of science as a system of justification, or a system of providing reason to think. So, if you always reach X conclusion through the scientific method, there would be unique reason to think that X is true. Now, what's critical is to realize that the authority of scientific facts are thanks to the process of science. You don't get the authority of the fact from the fact, but from the fact that the fact came from a scientific process. So the authority, the justification of assuming the fact, comes from the process of which gave you the fact, not the fact itself. So likewise, if Hegel can describe history as a process that arose to philosophy and arose to the now ultimately, then and he were to explain that process in a way that makes it justified and convincing, then there would be reason to assume the now. There would be reason to assume what has arisen in the now. And if you can't assume the now and what has arisen in the now, it is very difficult to even start thinking. What if maybe it would be better off if the world was what it was like 100 years ago? What if the world would be better off if we were to upset the entire socioeconomic order and change everything? You know, you can never know either way. Maybe we made a mistake to invent the internet. Maybe not. Like, how do you know? Like, how does thought even begin if you cannot assume the now? And so Hegel wants to basically shut the door to imagining that we should go back to the past, as he also wants to shut the door on us to think the future. And obviously, as the famous Owl of Nineveh, we're not really supposed to think about the future. We're not supposed to think about changing the political system. We are supposed to think the now. A way to look at this is, for Hegel, he wouldn't have us think if the internet was a mistake. He would have us think what we should do with the internet now. And in fact, if the collective consciousness arose to the internet, and if the internet is with us, there's reason to think the internet should be with us, or that it's justified to be with us. Maybe not, but we have to arrive at a conclusion that we should get rid of the internet after a very long process of working through an assumption that the internet should be with us. But again, a way to look at what Hegel is doing is Hegel wants us to not really think about should we get rid of the internet or, you know, what the internet might be used for in the future. He wants us to think about using the internet now, how to manage the internet. A way to think about Hegel is he's not so much problems and solutions as he is managing problems. He wants us to learn how to manage problems, and philosophy seems to be part of the art of learning and learning how to manage and live with problems. And that's a big thrust in Hegel. Now, in the same way that Hegel would have us assume the internet, he would have us assume the economy. He'd have us assume the government. He would have us assume the way that the world is globalized right now. Now, maybe it shouldn't be this way, but he would have us assume it. Because if you don't assume it, then you are going to end up as someone who tries to tear it all down and make things way worse. You could see Hegel as basically strongly siding on reformation as opposed to revolution. Revolution is dangerous, but there are times for reformation. And if a revolution is justified, it must go through the most extreme critical analysis, questioning, to be justified. But really, Hegel wants us to assume reformation, and more so to think in terms of how to live with what exists. And if philosophy has emerged in history, then there is reason to assume that philosophy is something we should engage with, and it is not a waste of time. Because again, if the process that arose to philosophy is the state, and that process is justified in like a quote-unquote scientific method, then there would be reason to assume the legitimacy of the philosophy as opposed to thinking that it's just a waste of time. Hegel makes a point to point out that there's nothing like no other field are people off the street more likely to assume they've mastered without ever studying. You know, you're not going to pull someone off the side of the street that thinks they're like an expert at quantum mechanics, but lots of people assume philosophy is a waste of time, or that they know their beliefs and they don't need to question them, that they're right in their values and they don't need to investigate them. Like, it's very interesting how many people view philosophy as a waste of time. And Hegel wants to remove that assumption. He is providing a justification or reason to think that if philosophy arose in the now, then you must wrestle with it. You must consider it. You are not justified to assume it is a waste of time. And so he's dealing with these people, and it's very similar to in the phenomenology when he mentions people who use intuition to assume that they know what they know without conceptual mediation. He wants to remove that possibility. Likewise, he wants to remove the possibility of in the society feeling justified to assume philosophy is a waste of time. And you hear it today, right? People think philosophy is privileged. It's extracurricular, it's extra. It's not something you must do. But what Hegel is trying to show is that if philosophy has arisen at this point in the development of the state through history, then there would be reason to think that the state needs philosophy, that we need philosophy to handle and live with the state today. And indeed, there seems to be something about philosophy that is necessary for the subject to come to terms with the subject. It makes me think of how Freud talked about psychoanalysis as something that people in first world nations would need, because that's when they would have more leisure and that's when they would have more time to reflect on themselves. Likewise, it would seem that as the world becomes more globalized, interconnected, and as difference encounters one another, you're going to need philosophy to live with that difference. And it's going to be extremely tempting as more and more difference encounters one another to interpret the anxiety that results from encountering that difference as evidence that we made a mistake and that we should go, that we took a wrong turn somewhere in the past, or that we need to do something to make sure we don't keep encountering difference in the future. Both of these are doors that Hegel is slamming shut by justifying the now. If we must think the now, we cannot fall into the temptation of existential anxiety being evidence that we did something wrong or we need to change the future. Hegel's removing those options from us. He will not allow us to think them. We have to think the now. Now, what's interesting about the argument that Hegel is posing is that the justification of philosophy comes from the fact that the state has emerged of philosophy. It is not within philosophy to philosophy. It is that philosophy has emerged as a practice. In the same way that ethics has emerged, that law has emerged, that technology has emerged. Really, you can see what Hegel is arguing here is as a reason to assume the justification of the existence of all these different fields. Not just philosophy, but philosophy plays a big role. So that's why I think we can see this as assuming the now. But this is also, I think, where it's important to understand that when Hegel talks about state, he's not just talking about government. By state, a way to think about this, for me, is the state of nature. There are many philosophers like Rousseau or Hobbes that the state of nature is a thought experiment that justifies a philosophical project. Hegel is not too big on, he does not like hypothetical thought experiments that justify the social order. For him, he wants the state of nature to be now. The justification for the political order and the way the world is today is not a state of nature, but the fact that the world is the way that it is. And that sounds circular until we understand that it arose this way because of humanity, because of people interacting with people who then solved their problems in certain ways that arose to what is now. So it's people. People have emergently arose to these things. And so that alone provides justification for assuming them, especially once you get that the movement of state is toward the right, not the wrong. Like by right, he's like the movement of collective consciousness is to be more right than wrong. That doesn't mean it can't err. It can't err, but the logic of the development of state is to increase rightness, which is collective consciousness. Now, I'm not saying the state is just collective consciousness, but I think that's a good way to think about it. And now, later in the paper, it's going to talk about the difference between spirit, which we see in phenomenology of spirit, and state, which we see here in the philosophy of right. But for now, I think it's important to just realize that state and spirit are similar, and that what the state is the state of humanity, which is the state of nature, which is the place where notion and nature are mixing and arising to what is, and therefore we should assume what is, because who are we to think that we are smarter than the collective consciousness? Who are we to think that we know what's better than what people in their own circumstances has arisen to and emerged to? This, of course, suggests that the utopian progressivism that justifies a larger central planner, which often has found justification in Hegel, is completely erroneous, and I think it is, because I think what you see in Hegel is a justification of emergence. Murray Rothbard had that famous lecture where he argued that society is not the state, that the government is not the same as the people, and that conflating those two together has been a big mistake. And I think we see in Hegel an understanding of that. The state is not the government. The state arises to the government, and the government has a very important role, and we should assume the government, and if it errs, we should reform it, not destroy it. But it's still critical to note that what we see here in the state is not merely a bureaucratic development. It is an emergence of the people. Now, as an emergence of the people, that would also suggest it is intersuppositional, which is an important term as described in the absolute choice, because the intersuppositional is conclusion that avoids some of the problems with assuming presuppositions, which Hegel is very concerned about. What we can see here, there's a few things. So if Hegel, in Hegel's argument, he wants to be pointing out, so there's a strong relationship between the state, the development of the state, and the assumption, and the justified assumption of the state and what it arises to, and therefore the justification of philosophy is something we should take seriously. And if we can assume philosophy through the state, which would overcome, would deal with this Gödel problem we've talked about, then there would be reason to just focus on the phenomenological journey of the phenomenology of spirit, and thus the spirit, the science of logic. If you can't make that move to justify focusing on the phenomenological journey, if you can't make that move, then why shouldn't I be trying to create the future or ignoring the hour of Nineveh? Why shouldn't I try to get back to the past, right? There would be reason to not start the phenomenological journey, because I couldn't assume that I would be justified to start the phenomenological journey. So Hegel is dealing with that step. He's justifying entering into the phenomenological journey, which for Hegel is philosophy, basically. I mean, you are stepping into philosophy. Now, I mean, there is an argument to be made that the phenomenology is not philosophy proper, because that would be the science of logic. But for Hegel, you can't do philosophy proper until you do the phenomenology. So that would be a technical distinction, but it would be very fair. But without the point is, if you can't assume the now, then you cannot assume that you are justified to do the phenomenology of spirit. And likewise, you could not assume that you are justified to not try to fix the future or return to the past. You would not be justified to assume that you would not be ethically erring in engaging in the phenomenology of spirit. So it's an important step. So Hegel, for one, without the state, which would go through individuals, ethics, family, property, contracts, and so on, there would be no philosophy. So if philosophy arises, it is in, with, and thanks to the state. And then, of course, if the state is unjustified, we cannot be sure that philosophy is justified versus a rationalization of the state of upper classes wanting to believe they're doing real work or privilege or so on and so forth. So these are all the steps that Hegel has to address in the Elements of the Philosophy of the Right. Now, if the state is justified and the state arose to philosophy by creating a clearing in which philosophy can be practiced through geopolitical and socioeconomic development, then there is reason to think practicing philosophy is justified too. And since the method and process which arose to philosophy is trustable, so our relationship to philosophy should prove strong as the scientific method strengthens our relationship to the facts it produces. So, in the same way that the facts of science are uniquely authoritative because of the process of the method, the scientific method that arose to them, likewise, the state is authoritative, it's reliable, it arose to philosophy, therefore there's reason to think that philosophy is justified. That we can engage in it and rely and trust that we're gaining something from it that we need. And indeed, I think if we can trust philosophy, we can then use it to avoid what some people have called the meaning crisis, effacement. We can come to terms with the subject, all of which seems extremely important to deal with, say, the coming technological singularity, as I have spoken about with Cadell last. So in all this, we can start to see how the philosophy of right relates as a justification to go into the phenomenology of spirit and then the science of logic. And likewise, we can start to see the state as a state of nature of which justifies the now. And by extension, we would also have reason to trust that philosophy can help us deal with the now, because the now arose to philosophy. This would also point to what Dr. Philippe Nicholas has talked about, where in Hegel, the implicit becomes explicit. What we need to deal with the explicit is embedded in the implicit and emerges into the explicit as we need it. And philosophy, there would be reason to thus think that philosophy is part of one of these things that we need to deal with the world that we're in today. And so there would be reason to think that the phenomenological journey is something that we need people to do to deal with the world today. Which would then lead us to assuming that the science of logic is something that we need people to do today, to deal with the now. And for me, that would be the movement from AA to AB, which would suggest that the elements of the philosophy of right provide us justification to assume the process by which we arrive at the place where we realize and are capable of living according to AB logic as opposed to AA logic, which for me would be the justification of a very necessary and important negation sublation, as I think is required so that we can avoid effacement. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Instagram, Anchor. Please check out the other parts of the paper. We will begin with part 4 next. And thank you so much for your time.